Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with the last notable names in African American history for February. I do this only in February, where it is African American History Month. So it'll be the last one for this year. And for this one, we are looking at the Amistad Mutiny. Yep, movie been made about it, and there is quite a bit to this. I was kind of surprised. This is from the Zen Education Project, of course, Zen, Howard Zen. But July 2nd, 1839, the Amistad Mutiny. July 2nd, 1839, Africans on the Cuban schooner Amistad rose up against their captors, seizing control of the ship which had been transporting them to chattel slavery. Here is the description from the Library of Congress. On July 2nd, 1839, Joseph Cinque led 52 fellow captive Africans currently abducted from the British Protectorate of Sierra Leone by Portuguese slave traders in a revolt aboard the Spanish schooner Amistad. The ship's navigator, who was spared in order to direct the ship back to Western Africa, managed instead to steer it northward. When the Amistad was discovered off the coast of Long Island, New York, it was hauled into New London, Connecticut by the U.S. Navy. Then President Martin Van Buren, guided in part by his desire to woo pro-slavery votes in his upcoming bid for election, wanted the prisoners returned to Spanish authorities in Cuba to stand trial for mutiny. A Connecticut judge, however, issued a ruling recognizing the defendants' rights as free citizens and ordering the U.S. government to escort them back to Africa. The U.S. government eventually appealed the case, and it ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court. Former President John Quincy Adams, who represented the Amistad Africans in the Supreme Court case, argued in their defense that it was the illegally enslaved Africans, rather than the Cubans, who were entitled to all the kindness and good offices due from a humane and Christian nation. Cinque testified on his own behalf. The victory in the case of the United States versus the Amistad was a significant success for the abolition movement. So yeah, Van Buren was wanting to get pro-slavery votes when this ship ended up being sneakily steered northward instead of toward Cuba, but northward to Long Island, New York. And yeah, so remember, Van Buren wanting to get these pro-slavery votes. It's 1839. Pro-slavery, of course, is the South. The Confederacy. We're in the days winding down until the U.S. Civil War would start in 1860. So 1839 to 1860, nearly a generation away, a little over. But yeah. For find primary documents about the Amistad case at the National Archives. And Sierra Leone is a West Africa coastal nation. Yeah, Western Africa. But yeah, let's look into this a little more. The Amistad case. February 1839, Portuguese slave hunters abducted a large group of Africans from Sierra Leone and was shipping them to Havana, Cuba, the center for the slave trade. The abduction violated all the treaties then in existence. Two Spanish plantation owners, Pedro Montes and Jose Ruiz, purchased 53 Africans and put them on board the Cuban schooner Amistad to ship them to a Caribbean plantation. Um, okay, making sure where I was at. On July the 1st, 1839, the Africans seized the ship and killed the captain and the cook and ordered Montes and Ruiz to sail to Africa. Yeah, I was like, take us back home. Montes and Ruiz actually steered the ship north, and on August the 24th, 1839, the Amistad was seized off Long Island, New York by the U.S. brig Washington. So the U.S. ship brig, the U.S. Washington. The schooner, its cargo, and all on board were taken to New London, Connecticut. The plantation owners were freed and the Africans were imprisoned on the charges of murder. Although the murder charges were dismissed, the Africans continued to be held in confinement, and the case went to trial in the Federal District Court in Connecticut. The plantation owners, government of Spain, and captain of the Washington each claimed rights to the Africans or compensation. President Van Buren was in favor of extraditing the Africans to Cuba. However, abolitionists in the North opposed extradition and raised money to defend the Africans. Had it not been for the actions of abolitionists in the U.S., the issues related to the Amistad might have ended quietly in an admiralty court. But they used the incident as a way to expose the evils of slavery and generate significant opposition to the practice. The brig Washington that seized the Amistad was commanded by Lieutenant Thomas R. Gedney. In maritime law, compensation is allowed to persons whose assistance saves a ship or its cargo from impending loss. Lieutenant Gedney claimed that it was with great difficulty and danger that he and his crew were able to recapture the Amistad from the Africans. They claimed that, had they not seized the vessel, it would have been a total loss to its rightful owners. Gedney and his crew believed they were entitled to salvage rights, or the full $65,000. At that time in U.S. history, even individuals acting in their official capacity as officials of the government were entitled to salvage rights. And you may go, salvage rights? But remember, at this point, slaves weren't people. They were chattel slavery, which means they were treated as objects rather than people. And so, yeah, the salvage rights would have been the right to salvage the slaves for their own ownership. In a libel or written statement in Admiralty Court, Gedney described the encounter with the Amistad. Because he sought salvage of the schooner and its cargo, he was very detailed in his account and itemized all of its cargo, estimating its value at $40,000 and the value of the Africans as slaves at $25,000. So yeah, the cargo, whatever they did have on there that wasn't slaves, was worth more. He relayed that the Africans could speak only native African languages and that one of the two Spanish plantation owners, Jose Ruiz, spoke English. Gedney included in his statement the account of the mutiny as told by Ruiz. Abolitionists hired Roger S. Baldwin, a lawyer from New Haven, and two New York attorneys, Seth Staples and Theodore Sedgwick, to serve as proctors or legal representatives for the Africans. The proctors submitted to the district court an answer to the libels of Lieutenant Gedney, Pedro Montes, and Jose Ruiz. It conveys the position of the Africans. Each of them are natives of Africa and were born free, and ever since have been and still of right are and ought to be free and not slaves. It states that they are not a part of a Spanish domestic slave trade and instead had been forcibly kidnapped from the African coast. And further that, while suffering great cruelty and oppression on board the Amistad, they were incited by the love of liberty natural to all men to take possession of the ship by force and seek asylum somewhere. The district court ruled that the case fell within federal jurisdiction and that the claims to the Africans as property were not legitimate because they were illegally held as slaves. The U.S. District Attorney filed an appeal to the Supreme Court. So it falls into the federal jurisdiction, and if I remember this right, it's like any cargo found in U.S. waters I'm probably not remembering this right, but it's a federal case instead of just a state or district case. So it's like, look, this has got to go up to the federals. So the U.S. District Attorney filed an appeal to the Supreme Court. The trial went before the Supreme Court. The Africans were represented by former U.S. President and descendant of American revolutionaries, John Quincy Adams. He is the son of the second president, John Adams. Quincy Adams, I think, was president number 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. Preparing months before the proceedings opened for 8.5 hours, the 73-year-old Adams passionately and eloquently defended the Africans' right to freedom on both legal and moral grounds, referring to treaties prohibiting the slave trade and to the Declaration of Independence. The Supreme Court decided in favor of the Africans, stating that they were free individuals, kidnapped and transported illegally. They had never been born slaves. Senior Justice Joseph Story wrote and read the decision. It was the ultimate right of all human beings in extreme cases to resist oppression and to apply force against ruinous injustice. The opinion asserted the Africans' right to resist unlawful slavery. The court ordered the immediate release of the Amistad Africans. 35 of the survivors were returned to their homeland. The others died at sea or in prison while awaiting trial. So yeah, that's from the National Archives. Let's look at Britannica. July 2nd, 1839. Let's see. This one says July 1st, 1839. It was at the very beginning of July, 1839, so we know that. So this says July 2nd. This says July 1st. This says July 2nd. So the slave rebellion that took place on a slave ship, Amistad, near the coast of Cuba and had important political and legal repercussions in the American abolition movement. The mutineers were captured and tried in the United States, and a surprising victory
in the American
for the
abolition
country's
movement.
anti-slavery
The
forces
mutineers
resulted
were
in
captured and tried
1841
in
when
the United
US Supreme
States,
Court
and a
freed the
surprising
rebels.
victory
A
for the
committee
country's
formed to defend
anti-slavery
the slaves
forces
later
resulted
developed
in
into
1841
the American
when the U.S.
Missionary
Supreme Court
Association, incorporated in 1846. The Spanish schooner Amistad was selling from Havana to Puerto Principe, Cuba, when the ship's unwilling passengers, 53 slaves recently abducted from Africa, revolted. Led by Joseph Cinque, they killed the captain and the cook, but spared the life of a Spanish navigator so that he could sail them home to Sierra Leone. The navigator managed instead to sail the Amistad generally northward. 2 months later, the U.S. Navy seized the ship off Long Island, New York, and towed it into New London, Connecticut. The mutineers were held in jail in New Haven, Connecticut, a state in which slavery was legal. The Spanish embassy's demand for the return of the Africans to Cuba led to an 1840 trial in a Hartford, Connecticut federal court. New England abolitionist Lewis Tappan stirred public sympathy for the African slaves, while the U.S. government took the pro-slavery side. U.S. President Martin Van Buren ordered a Navy ship sent to Connecticut to return the Africans to Cuba immediately after the trial. A candidate for re-election that year, he anticipated a ruling against the defendants and hoped to gain pro-slavery votes by removing the Africans before abolitionists could appeal to a higher court. Prosecutors argued that as slaves, the mutineers were subject to laws governing conduct between slaves and their masters. But trial testimony determined that while slavery was legal in Cuba, importation of slaves from Africa was
legal in Cuba, importation of slaves from Africa was not.
The actual slave trade, I think, was stopped first.
The actual slave trade, I think, was stopped first. Before there was an end to slavery.
So for a few years, it was mainly, you have kids, they belong to us.
So for a few years, it was mainly, you have kids, they belong to us.
It was more or less, these are the slaves that are here.
Yeah. It was
We're
more or
not
less,
shipping any
these
more
are the
in.
slaves that are here.
Therefore, the judge ruled,
We're not
rather
shipping
than
any more in.
being merchandise, the Africans
Therefore,
were
the judge
victims
ruled,
of kidnapping
rather
and had
than
the right to
being
escape their
merchandise,
captors in any way
the Africans
they
were
could.
victims of
When
kidnapping
the
and
US
had the
government
right
appealed
to
the case
escape their
before the US
captors in
Supreme
any
Court
way
the
they
next
could.
year, Congressman
When the U.S. government
and former
appealed the case
President
before
John
the U.S.
Quincy
Supreme
Adams
Court the
argued
next year,
eloquently for the
Congressman
Amistad
and
rebels.
former President
The
John Quincy Adams argued
donations
eloquently for the
helped
Amistad rebels.
The Supreme Court upheld the lower court, and private and missionary society donations helped the 35 surviving Africans secure
and private and
home.
missionary society
They arrived
donations
in
helped
Sierra
the
Leone
35
in
surviving
January
Africans secure passage
1842,
home.
along
They
with
arrived
5
in Sierra
missionaries and
Leone in
teachers who
January
intended to found a Christian
1842,
mission.
along with 5 missionaries and teachers
Spain
who intended to
continued
found a Christian
to
mission.
insist that the United States pay
Spain
indemnification
continued
for the Cuban
to
vessel.
insist that
The U.S.
United
Congress
States pay
intermittently
indemnification for
debated
the
the
Cuban
Amistad
vessel.
case without
The U.S.
resolution
Congress
for more than 2
intermittently
decades until
debated
the
the
American
Amistad
Civil
case
War
without
began
resolution
in 1861.
for more than 2 decades until the American Civil War
1838
began in
1839 to 1861 was when this took place. to when the Civil War broke out. So yeah, slavery was still a primary source of income in the United States, especially in the Confederacy. Now, we'll look at the leader himself, who led this revolt aboard the Amistad. Also known as Joseph Cinque or Cinques, and sometimes referred to mononymously as Cinque, as a West African man of the Mende people who led a revolt of many Africans on the Spanish slave ship La Amistad in July 1839. After the ship was taken into custody by the U.S. Revenue Marine, Cinque and his fellow Africans were eventually tried for mutiny and killing officers on the ship in a case known as the U.S. versus the Amistad. This reached the U.S. Supreme Court, where Cinque and his fellow Africans were found to have rightfully defended themselves from being enslaved through the illegal Atlantic slave trade and were released. The U.S. government did not provide any aid to the acquitted Mende people. The United Missionary Society, a black group founded by James W.C. Pennington, helped raise money for the return of the 35 survivors to Sierra Leone in 1842. Now, the man himself, Joseph Cinque, was born around 1814 in what is now Sierra Leone. His exact date of birth remains unknown. He was a rice farmer and married with 3 children when he was sold into slavery to redeem a debt. So yeah, apparently he was captured and sold into slavery. He was bought by the Viking Siaka, and in 1839 sold to Pedro Blanco, a Spanish slave trader. He was imprisoned on the Portuguese slave ship Tecora in violation of treaties prohibiting the international slave trade. Cinque was taken to Havana, Cuba, where he was sold with 110 others to Spaniards Jose Ruiz and Pedro Montes. So yeah, he was living fine, farming, married, 3 children, but was sold into slavery and bought by the Vai King Siaka. The Vai are Mende people who live mostly in Liberia, with a small minority living in southeastern Sierra Leone. So yeah. Which we know Joseph Cinque was a Mende tribesman as well. So yeah. And of course, the king then sold him to Pedro Blanco, Spanish slave trader, who brought him to Havana, Cuba, where he was purchased by Jose Ruiz and Pedro Montes. The Spaniards arranged to transport the captives on the coastal schooner La Amistad in the intention of selling them as slaves at ports along the coast of Cuba or for work on sugar plantations. Sugar was a huge cash crop in the Mediterranean, so yeah, I'm not surprised on that. On June the 30th, Cinque led a revolt, killing the captain and the cook of the ship. 2 African captives also died, and 2 sailors escaped. The Africans took Ruiz and Montes, the merchants who had purchased them, as prisoners and demanded that they direct the ship back to Sierra Leone. Instead, at night, the pair directed the navigator in the opposite direction toward the Americas, in the hope of attracting the attention of one of their fellow Spaniards who would save their ship and regain control. The ship had an uneven course between the coast of the United States and Africa. After about 2 months, it reached the U.S. near Long Island, New York, and members of the USS Washington boarded the vessel when they discovered what had happened, as told by the Spaniards. They charged the Africans with mutiny and murder. The ship and the Mende were taken to New Haven, Connecticut, to await trial. The two Spaniards claimed that the Africans had been born in Cuba and were already slaves at the time of their purchase, and were therefore legal property. Interpreters from Mende to English were found who enabled the Africans to tell their story to attorneys and the court. Cinque served as the group's informal representative. The district and the circuit courts found in favor of the Africans. The Spanish parties and their government appealed to the Supreme Court of the U.S. In March 1841, the Supreme Court ruled that the Africans mutinied to regain their freedom after being kidnapped and sold illegally. The advocacy of former U.S. President John Quincy Adams, together with Roger Sherman Baldwin, was critical to the Africans' defense. The court ordered the Africans freed and returned to Africa if they wished. This decision was against the protest of President Martin Van Buren, who worried about relations with Spain and the implications for domestic slavery. Cinque and other Mende reached their homeland in 1842. In Sierra Leone, Cinque encountered civil war. He and his group maintained contact with the local mission for a while, but Cinque left to trade along the coast. Little is known of his later life, but rumors circulated. Some maintained that he had moved to Jamaica. Others held that he'd become a merchant or a chief, perhaps trading in enslaved people himself. Yeah, remember, often many slaves were given from one nation to those purchasing slaves because that nation's enemies were essentially captured and sold as slaves to become slaves. So, yeah. The latter charge derived from oral accounts of Africa cited by the 20th century author William A. Owens, who claimed that he had seen letters from the AMA missionaries suggesting Cinque was a slave trader. More recently, historians such as Howard Jones in 2000 and Joseph Yanieli in 2009 have argued that although some of the Africans associated with the Amistad probably did engage in the slave trade upon their return, given the nature of the regional economy at that time, the allegations of Cinque's involvement seems implausible in view of the lack of evidence and the unlikelihood of a conspiracy of silence leaving no traces. Samuel Pieh, the great-great-grandson of Sengbe Pieh and language coach for the 97 Amistad film, stated that Cinque became a key figure in Sierra Leone and helped to Christianize the country. So yeah, we get a good look at the man who led the Amistad Rebellion. That was a lot of reading, because a lot of it I didn't even realize myself. I just knew it's a famous case of African revolt on a ship. That's it. I knew nothing else about this case, so yeah. But apparently, yeah, his African name was Sengbe Pieh, but he went by Joseph Cinque when he was imprisoned by the Spanish. So yeah. But yeah, that has been a look at Sengbe Pieh, Joseph Cinque, and the Amistad. But yeah, that was an interesting one because, like I said, I didn't know a whole lot about that particular case, so it was interesting to read up on. But we'll go ahead and end this episode here. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing. Ask them to cite their sources. I'll be putting my links and sources in the description box below the video. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.